Somewhere beneath the sagebrush of the Arizona desert, under the wheat fields of Kansas, and buried in the red dirt of the Texas Panhandle, there are ruts in the earth that have not felt a wheel in over a century and a half. They run for thousands of miles, cutting across 4 time zones, through mountain passes and dry riverbeds, connecting forts that no longer stand to towns that no longer exist. For a few explosive years in the middle of the 19th century, these tracks were the fastest, most important communication line in the United States. A letter could travel from the Mississippi River to the Pacific Ocean in about 3 weeks, carried by men who drove teams of horses through Apache territory, Comanche territory, blizzards, flash floods, and outlaw ambushes, without ever fully stopping. Then, almost overnight, it was gone. The stations were abandoned. The route markers rotted. The people who ran it scattered into other lives, and within 20 years, most Americans had forgotten it had ever existed at all. This is the story of how the United States built the greatest overland transportation network the world had ever seen, and how it vanished almost as quickly as it was built. To understand why this network needed to exist in the first place, you have to picture the United States in the years right after the Mexican-American War ended in 1848. Almost overnight, the country had swallowed an enormous stretch of new territory: California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico. Then, within months, gold was discovered at Sutter's Mill, and the population of California exploded from a few thousand to well over 100,000 in a matter of years. Suddenly the United States had a booming, wealthy, strategically vital state sitting 3,000 miles from its own capital, with no railroad, no telegraph, and no reliable way to move a letter, a newspaper, or a government order between the two coasts. A piece of mail sent from New York might travel by ship all the way around the tip of South America, a voyage that could take 4 to 6 months. There was a faster option, cutting across the Isthmus of Panama, but that route came with its own brutal cost. Travelers faced tropical disease, and outbreaks of cholera killed some passengers before they ever reached the Pacific side. For a nation that was rapidly defining itself by its western frontier, this was an unacceptable gap. California needed to feel connected to Washington, or there were real fears that it might drift away entirely, perhaps even declare itself an independent republic. The pressure to solve this problem became one of the defining transportation questions of the decade. The answer that emerged was audacious in a way that is hard to fully appreciate today. Rather than wait for a transcontinental railroad, which was still decades away from being technically and politically possible, the federal government decided to solve the problem with horses, wagons, and sheer human endurance. In 1857, Congress authorized a contract for a semi-weekly overland mail service that would run nearly 3,000 miles, from the edge of settled Missouri all the way to San Francisco, and it demanded that the mail make the entire journey in 25 days or less. The contract was awarded to a stagecoach operator named John Butterfield, who had already built a reputation running express and stage lines in the East. Butterfield and his partners were handed $600,000 a year to make this happen, an enormous sum for the era, but the price of failure was just as steep. If the mail did not move, Butterfield lost the contract, and quite possibly his fortune along with it. What Butterfield built in the following 12 months was staggering in scale. His route deliberately avoided the most direct path across the country, the one that would later become famous as the Oregon and California trails, because that northern corridor was buried in snow for much of the winter, and a mail line that stopped for 4 months a year was useless. Instead, Butterfield's engineers plotted a long, curving southern route that dipped down through Arkansas, Texas, and the New Mexico and Arizona territories before swinging north into California, deliberately avoiding the worst of the mountain snows. The final route stretched close to 2,800 miles, making it, by most accounts, the longest stagecoach line ever operated anywhere on Earth. To make that distance survivable, Butterfield's company built somewhere around 130 relay stations along the way, roughly every 15 to 25 miles, each one stocked with fresh horses or mules, food, and often a station keeper's family living in genuine isolation, sometimes hundreds of miles from the nearest town. At the peak of operations, Butterfield employed more than 800 people and kept nearly 2,000 head of stock moving through this pipeline of exhaustion and dust. It cost over $1 million just to get the system running before a single letter was carried, an investment that today would be worth tens of millions. On September 15, 1858, the first stagecoaches pulled out from the eastern terminals in Tipton, Missouri, and Memphis, Tennessee, their routes converging in Fort Smith, Arkansas, before continuing west as one line. Inside the coaches, up to 6 passengers were crammed together for a journey that did not pause for sleep. There were no hotel stops, no overnight breaks in a real bed. If you paid your $200 fare, roughly equivalent to thousands of dollars today, you climbed into the coach and you stayed there for 23 or 24 days straight, trading naps in cramped, jolting darkness for the chance to see the Pacific coast in under a month. Passengers were warned to bring their own firearms. They rode past the bones of failed wagon trains, through country where conflict with Apache, Comanche, and other native nations defending their homelands from encroaching settlement was a constant, deadly risk for everyone on the trail. Dust, heat that could reach past 110 degrees in the desert stretches, and bone-jarring cold in the high passes were simply the price of the ticket. And yet it worked. The first westbound stage rolled into San Francisco not in 25 days, but in under 24, stunning a public that had assumed the deadline was more marketing than promise. Newspapers up and down the coast treated the arrival like a national event, because in a sense, it was. The two halves of the country, for the first time, felt genuinely connected. But here is where the story gets more complicated, and more human, than the newspaper headlines let on. Running a stagecoach line across nearly 3,000 miles of largely unmapped, often hostile terrain was not simply a matter of good planning. It required a small army of station keepers, many of them living with their wives and children in adobe huts or dugouts hundreds of miles from any other American settlement, responsible for having fresh teams ready at a moment's notice, 24 hours a day, in weather that could kill an unprepared traveler within hours. Drivers navigated mountain switchbacks in the dark, guided only by moonlight and memory, because the mail could not wait for daylight. There are documented accounts of stations being attacked, of drivers found frozen at their posts after guiding a coach through a blizzard, of entire relay points abandoned overnight when the danger became too great. This was not a business run by faceless corporations from a boardroom back east. It was, in a very real sense, held together by a scattering of individually courageous, often desperate people willing to live at the literal edge of the map for a paycheck and the promise of the frontier. And just as this extraordinary system was hitting its stride, history intervened in a way nobody at Butterfield's company could control. By early 1861, the United States was tearing itself apart. The southern route, Butterfield's entire 2,800-mile investment, ran directly through Texas and Confederate territory, and as secession spread, it became not just impractical but militarily dangerous to keep a federal mail line running straight through the heart of what was about to become the Confederacy. In March of 1861, the government made the decision to abandon the southern route entirely. Just weeks before the first shots of the Civil War were fired at Fort Sumter, the contract was formally shifted north, to a route running through the Central Plains instead, out of St. Joseph, Missouri, toward Salt Lake City and on to California. Confederate forces in Texas seized some of Butterfield's remaining stagecoaches and equipment outright. The original Butterfield Trail, the longest and, at least for a moment, the most famous overland route in American history, was simply switched off. Stations that had taken $1 year and $1 million to build were left to the desert. Some were never used again for anything at all. The central route that replaced it brings us to one of the most famous, and most misunderstood, chapters connected to this entire story, the Pony Express. Contrary to the romantic image many people carry, the Pony Express was never actually the primary overland mail solution. It was a short-lived, privately funded publicity and speed experiment, launched in April of 1860 by the operators of the new Central Route, in part to prove that the shorter, more direct path across the plains and the Rocky Mountains could move information faster than anyone thought possible, and in part to help win the very government mail contract that Butterfield had briefly held. Young riders, some barely out of their teens, relayed mail pouches on horseback across roughly 1,900 miles between Missouri and California, changing horses every 10 to 15 miles and riders every 75 to 100 miles, cutting the delivery time for urgent mail down to about 10 days. It was thrilling, it was dangerous, and it captured the public imagination in a way almost nothing else in the era did. But it was also a financial catastrophe for the men who ran it. The Pony Express never turned a profit, and it lasted barely 18 months before it was killed off entirely, not by outlaws or weather, but by the completion of the Transcontinental telegraph line in October of 1861. The moment a message could travel from coast to coast at the speed of electricity, the fastest horse in the country simply could not compete. The company that had built the Pony Express went bankrupt within months, and its remaining stagecoach assets were bought up by a shrewd, ambitious entrepreneur named Ben Holladay, a man who would go on to build the largest stagecoach empire the American West had ever seen. Holladay understood something that a lot of his competitors did not. The future of overland transportation was not going to be about a single glamorous route, it was going to be about controlling as much of the network as possible before the inevitable arrival of the railroad. Through the early and mid-1860s, Holladay expanded aggressively, eventually operating well over 2,000 miles of active stage lines stretching from the plains into Colorado, Utah, and beyond, pushing his coaches into mining boomtowns like Denver that were exploding with new populations and desperate for reliable mail and passenger service. He was a hard, sometimes ruthless businessman, but he was also remarkably far-sighted. As early as the mid-1860s, Holladay could see the surveying crews and construction camps of the Union Pacific and Central Pacific railroads creeping steadily westward and eastward toward each other, and he understood exactly what that meeting point would mean for men in his line of work. Rather than wait to be run out of business, Holladay sold his entire stagecoach empire in November of 1866 to a company that had started as a small express and banking outfit in the California gold fields and had since grown into a financial powerhouse, Wells, Fargo and Company. The price was $1.5 million in cash, plus stock, an extraordinary payday that let Holladay walk away and reinvest in railroads himself, essentially betting on the very technology that was about to make his old business worthless. Wells Fargo, now controlling nearly the entire network of stage lines running from the Mississippi to California, briefly became the largest stagecoach operation on the planet. Picture it, one company's name painted on the side of coaches running across nearly the entire western half of the continent, moving mail, gold, passengers, and increasingly, valuable cargo that made those coaches irresistible targets. Throughout the 1860s, Wells Fargo's stages were hit by holdups so frequently that the company kept detailed records of the losses, hundreds of robberies over the decade, totaling hundreds of thousands of dollars stolen at gunpoint on lonely stretches of road. It is one of the reasons the company built such a formidable detective and security operation, one that would go on to chase down some of the most notorious stagecoach bandits in Western history in the years that followed. But even as Wells Fargo tightened its grip on the overland stage business, the clock on the entire industry was already running out, and everyone in the business knew it. On May 10, 1869, at a desolate spot called Promontory Summit in the Utah Territory, the Union Pacific and Central Pacific Railroads finally met. A ceremonial golden spike was driven into the final tie, and for the first time in human history, a person could travel from the Atlantic coast to the Pacific coast entirely by rail, in about a week, in relative comfort, without a single stagecoach relay, without a single overnight stretch spent bracing against a wall of jolting wood and leather. The effect on the great transcontinental stage lines was immediate and brutal. Almost overnight, there was no longer any reason to run mail or passengers along the old overland routes that paralleled the new tracks. Wells Fargo, along with every other operator still running long-distance stage service, simply stopped. Relay stations that had operated around the clock for a decade were shuttered within weeks. Station masters and their families, some of whom had spent years of their lives in remote outposts precisely because the overland stage needed them there, packed up and left, often for good. It is worth sitting with how fast this transition happened. An entire industry, one that had taken years and millions of dollars and hundreds of lives to build, one that had been treated as an irreplaceable national lifeline just a decade earlier, became functionally obsolete within a single news cycle. That did not mean the stagecoach vanished from American life entirely, and this is a detail that often gets lost in the popular telling. For decades after 1869, stagecoaches continued to operate in the gaps the railroad had not yet reached, connecting isolated mining camps in Colorado, Montana, and Arizona to the nearest rail depot, carrying mail into pockets of Texas and New Mexico that would not see a train line for another generation. Wells Fargo itself pivoted, leaning harder into its express shipping and eventually its banking business, activities that would carry the company's name forward into the 20th and 21st centuries long after its stagecoaches had been retired to museums. But the great transcontinental routes, the ones that had once represented the absolute cutting edge of American connectivity, the Butterfield Trail, the Central Overland Route, the various incarnations of Holladay's and then Wells Fargo's long-haul lines, these effectively ceased to exist as through routes almost the moment the golden spike went in. Within another generation, the arrival of the automobile in the early 20th century finished off what little long-distance stagecoach business remained anywhere in the country. What is left of all this today is scattered, quiet, and easy to miss if you are not looking for it. In parts of Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas, you can still find sections of the old Butterfield roadbed, sometimes little more than a shallow depression worn into the desert floor, marked with a small plaque by a historical society decades after the fact. A handful of the original relay stations survive as ruins or partial reconstructions, their adobe walls slowly returning to the earth they were built from. Ghost towns that sprang up specifically to service the stage lines, places that had a blacksmith, a corral, maybe a small trading post, and not much else, are gone entirely, remembered only in old survey maps and the occasional local museum exhibit. The people who lived and worked this network, the drivers who memorized hundreds of miles of trail by feel, the station keepers who raised children in some of the most isolated postings in American history, the young riders of the Pony Express whose average tenure barely lasted a year before the whole enterprise folded, left behind surprisingly few detailed personal records. Much of what we know comes from company ledgers, newspaper accounts, and the occasional surviving letter, fragments of a system that, for all its scale and importance, operated and disappeared faster than most of the people involved could fully document it. It is a strange kind of historical footnote to sit with. For roughly a decade, the Overland Stagecoach network was, without exaggeration, one of the most important pieces of infrastructure in the entire country, a physical thread holding together a nation that had expanded faster than its ability to communicate with itself. It moved the mail that kept California politically and emotionally tied to Washington during the years leading into the Civil War. It carried the news, the money, the family letters, and the government orders that a rapidly growing western frontier depended on. And then, the moment a faster technology arrived, it was retired almost without ceremony, its stations abandoned, its routes left to erode back into the landscape, its workers absorbed into whatever came next. There was no grand farewell for the Butterfield Trail. There was no monument built in 1869 to mark the end of an era that had, only a decade earlier, been treated as a national triumph. The stagecoach simply stopped, and the country, already looking ahead to the railroad, the telegraph, and eventually the automobile, largely stopped looking back. If you had lived in 1858, and someone offered you a seat on that first Butterfield stage out of Missouri, 24 straight days across deserts, mountains, and contested frontier, with only a rifle and a stranger's shoulder for company, would you have taken it? Tell us in the comments what you think it says about a country that built something so enormous, so dangerous, and so vital, only to let it disappear so completely within a single generation.